witnessing the most recent manifestation of a decades-long conflict between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim political entity derived from the Muslim Brotherhood, an Egyptian extremist organization that was actually encouraged to, in the 1980s, to become politically relevant in the Palestinian issue by Israel, which used the creation of Hamas as a means of diluting the influence of Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization. In 2006, Israel encouraged Hamas's rise to political relevance. They went from being simply a terrorist organization that committed atrocious acts of criminality against the Israeli people to a political entity that was capable of governing the Gaza Strip, a Palestinian enclave that was part of the Palestinian Authority, but Israel was trying to, again, as I said, dilute the authority and legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority. So they helped promote Hamas, and Hamas won an election, then physically ousted the Palestinian Authority from Gaza. And ever since then, Israel's been paying the price, because Hamas's charter, I believe paragraph 12 of their charter, calls for the physical elimination of Israel. I don't think Israel's ever taken Hamas seriously in that regard. They felt that Hamas was an entity that they could end up intimidating and otherwise coercing into deviating from the charter of their chartered task of the destruction of Israel to becoming a political entity whose singular focus was governance of Gaza. And I think that's ultimately what happened here, is that Israel lost sight of the real problem. The real problem, of course, people will say, well, the real problem is Hamas. And I'd say, no, the real problem is Israel. The real problem is Israeli policy that goes back 7+ decades to the creation of Israel. And the Nakba, the catastrophe that the Palestinian people went through when the Israelis used force to murder, intimidate, and otherwise evict tens of thousands of Palestinians from their homes. Many of those homes were around the area we call Gaza today. And then Israel's, continuous policy of oppression, repression of the Palestinian people. And today we have a situation where the Palestinians are second-class citizens in their own homeland. And there was a time in Israel's history back in the 1990s, early mid-1990s, when Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister, and he actively pursued a peaceful resolution to the problem, the Oslo Accords. Oslo I signed in 1993, Oslo II signed in September of 1995. But he was assassinated shortly thereafter, assassinated because of the actions and words of Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. Back in 1995, Benjamin Netanyahu, then the head of the opposition, participated in rallies where Yitzhak Rabin, a genuine hero of Israel, was called a traitor, a betrayer of Israel. They even went so far as to get conservative rabbis, radicals, to go Old Testament on Yitzhak Rabin and provide, the Israeli equivalent of a fatwa, an edict from a rabbi authorizing Yitzhak Rabin to be killed because he has betrayed the Hebrew faith. And on November 4th of 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli fanatic who believed he had been told by a rabbi to kill Yitzhak Rabin. This was Benjamin Netanyahu's fault. And after Rabin's death, there was no chance. Netanyahu and the political right rose to ascendancy, and ever since then they've been promulgating policies that have been horrific towards the Palestinian people. I will never forgive the Palestinian leadership for what they have done. They've been horrifically corrupt. They have not been efficient, and they have not served the Palestinian people well. But none of the problems of Palestinian leadership justify the Israeli approach. Indeed, had the Israelis taken a more open-minded approach, a more conciliatory approach, there might have been more effective Palestinian leadership instead of the leadership they have today, which has become accustomed to being bought off by the United States and bought off by Israel to continue to allow their people to suffer, to build their political and financial empires on the suffering of the Palestinian people, which many of the people in the Palestinian Authority do to this day. So I condemn them. I also condemn Hamas. I mean, when I was in Israel in the 1990s, almost every trip I took to Israel, there was a Hamas terrorist event, sometimes within 100 meters of where I was, sometimes within a few blocks, but always resulting in the deaths of innocent Israeli civilians. There's no justification for Hamas's actions. They were horrific, and they are horrific to this day. Any targeting, deliberate targeting of civilians, whether it's done by Hamas or done by the Israeli military, is a contemptuous and action that must be condemned by all parties involved. But again, having said that, what happened is that Hamas acted out on, I mean, you're going to be what you are. Hamas is a terrorist organization whose charter calls for the physical destruction of Israel. Why anybody believes Hamas will behave anything other than what they are is beyond me. And Hamas acted out on their charter. They carried out a very well-planned assault by highly trained professional people. I think when we use the term terrorist, which may make us feel good, what we end up doing is somehow diminishing the lethality of the enemy that we're up against. These are soldiers of Hamas who are very well trained, very well organized, very well equipped, and very deadly. The initial phase of their attack took out the Israeli Defense Forces positions. This was a military-on-military engagement that Hamas won decisively. Later on, Hamas moved into military installations, including the camp, the headquarters of the Gaza division, where they slaughtered Israeli soldiers. One has to ask the question, why were the Israeli soldiers in the position to be slaughtered? Why weren't they prepared for this? They are, after all, professional soldiers in an ostensible combat zone, but they were caught sleeping. So too were the civilians, the citizens of Israel that these soldiers were supposed to be protecting, thousands of them in the kibbutzes that surrounded Gaza, thousands of them in the towns and villages and cities that surrounded Gaza. Hamas surged into these areas and committed atrocities, the likes of which can never be excused. While many of these atrocities have turned out to be exaggerated, for instance, right now there's a story going around about 40 beheaded children. There's no evidence that took place, none whatsoever. There's also a lot of talk about the raping of women. If anybody knows anything about Islamic fundamentalists, the raping of women is the last thing that they would be engaged in. But what they did do is kill in a very wanton fashion hundreds of unarmed civilians. That's murder, and it should be condemned and must be condemned. But they did this for a reason. I mean, there's a methodology behind their terror, and the goal was to enrage Israel. I mean, everything that Israel's doing right now is what Hamas wanted them to do, up to and including the surrounding of Gaza, the cutting off of energy supplies, water supplies, and the bombing of Gaza, this ongoing war crime being perpetrated by Israel against the civilians of Gaza, the Palestinian civilians, is planned by Hamas for a reason. And the reason is they want to turn the tables. They committed horrific crimes early on, and what they're doing now is getting Israel to commit even more horrific crimes. And what Israel is going to do is lose the support of the rest of the world, which is what Hamas wants. What Hamas will want the rest of the world to start demanding that Israel stop their bombing. And the key to that is Hamas has achieved a victory unlike any achieved by Hamas before. the physical destruction of the Israeli armed forces, of the embarrassment of Israel. And if Hamas can survive the Israeli retaliation, then Hamas emerges as the victor, as an entity that Israel and the world will have to deal with. Right now, Israel's saying they're going to eliminate Hamas, but they're not. How do you eliminate Hamas when they're hiding amongst more than 2 million people in one of the most urbanized environments? And all Israel is doing is blowing up buildings. People need to study the Battle of Stalingrad, need to study the battles of Monte Cassino in Italy in 1944, need to study the most recent battles at Mariupol and Bakhmut in Ukraine to understand how stupid it is to blow up a city, allow an enemy to dig into the rubble, and then try to go and remove them. Remember, Hamas isn't above ground. They're below ground. They're not being harmed, at least they're not in a meaningful fashion, by this bombing. Israel is harming innocent Palestinian civilians. But this is what Hamas intended to do. Israel had believed that they had successfully bribed Hamas into becoming an entity focused on the government, the governance of the Palestinians of Gaza. And indeed, this belief by Israel blinded them to the overwhelming amount of data that was coming in showing that Hamas was preparing to carry out such an attack. Hamas has proven Israel to be wrong, and now Israel is going to have to learn how to deal with Hamas in a post-conflict environment, because I do believe Hamas will fight the Israeli army to a standstill. There will be a termination of this conflict that has Hamas not only surviving, but emerging stronger than they were when they came in. The Palestinian people are by and large peaceful. They are suffering egregious harm. And while they are angry, they aren't the ones perpetrating these violence. The people carrying this out, again, the most recent attack, were done by hardcore Hamas fighters, people who have bought into the Muslim Brotherhood's, very strict interpretation of Islam, people who have taken an oath to a charter that calls for the destruction of Israel. This isn't what the Palestinian people are doing. But once again, it's the Palestinian people that are paying the heaviest price. Those children who are dying in Gaza today because Israeli pilots flying American airplanes, dropping American bombs, are slaughtering them by the hundreds. Those are innocents. They have nothing to do with this, but they're the ones paying the price. The Hamas fighters, they're underground in a bunker, living, waiting for the moment that the Israeli army crosses into Gaza so they can rise up from a tunnel behind them and kill them, slaughter them like lambs. That's what Hamas is waiting for, but not the Palestinian people. They don't want this. They didn't ask for this. All they want to do is live in their own land. They didn't ask to be confined in an open air concentration camp. Some people call it an open air prison, but it's not a prison. A prison is where you put convicts, people who have committed crimes. The Palestinian people are innocent. They have not committed any crimes. Their only crime, apparently, in the eyes of the Israelis, is to have been born. That is not a crime. They deserve to live normal lives. They don't deserve to be cooped up. They deserve the right of return. They should be allowed to go back to the land, to the villages where their parents, their grandparents lived before they were forcefully evicted by the Israelis in 1948. That's what should be happening, but it's not happening. And now innocent Israelis are paying the price. But again, let's put it this way. I don't believe any civilian should be killed. It's a war crime. It shouldn't happen.
Right.
I'm tired of talking about innocent Israelis. Let me give you an example. In the town of Sderot, north of Gaza, the Hamas fighters came in and they perpetrated crimes. They kicked down the doors and they killed the Israeli civilians, unarmed civilians who lived there. And people go, well, these innocent Israelis. Well, let me remind people that in 2014, these same innocent Israeli citizens were sitting up on a hill outside of Sderot while the Israeli Air Force bombed Gaza, killing hundreds of innocent Palestinians. And as the Israeli Air Force bombed them, as the explosions went off, these people were eating a barbecue and cheering. And when asked about this by the media, they said that the Palestinians aren't humans, they're animals. They deserve everything they're getting. There's nothing innocent about that. Those citizens of Sderot and those people who live around Gaza know damn well what's going on, just like the Germans that lived next to the concentration camps that were disposing of Jewish bodies in crematorium, and they'd wipe off falling ash from their shoulder and march on as if nothing happened. These people allowed this open-air concentration camp to exist for decades. They cheered as the Israeli Air Force dropped bombs on those people, those humans that lived just a few miles away from them, cheering while they were slaughtered. And you want me to say they're innocent? Not on your life. They shouldn't have been killed. They're civilians. Their death is a crime, and hopefully there will be justice for this. But there's nothing. Let's erase the hubris of the West. We are the most important people in the world. Don't you know, you stupid, ignorant Palestinians, that Ukraine is the number one problem in the world today? We are singularly focused on Ukraine. How dare you manifest your issues today to interfere with our singular focus on bringing Russia down in Ukraine? The Palestinian people don't care. They are suffering. Their suffering goes on and on and on, and we are blind to it. We are blind to it. The only good thing that's coming out of this Hamas crime, and it is a crime, is maybe the West will now wake up and say, whoa, how did this happen? How do we prevent this from happening again? But it's not going to be about how do we work with Hamas, although unfortunately, if Hamas wins, and it looks like they will win, we're going to have to deal with Hamas. But we should start talking about how do you solve the problem of Hamas? You take away their political legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinian people. How do you do that? By empowering the Palestinian people to live as human beings on land that belongs to them. But that's not what we do. We've ignored them. We just continue to ignore them on a daily basis. We don't care about them. They don't exist. When a Palestinian child dies of a disease, or when a mother is unable to have a job, or whatever problems befall them, because it is a 2 million person ghetto there in Gaza. It's a ghetto run by slumlords, and the ultimate slumlord is Israel, where you have Israelis determining whether or not a handful of Gazan citizens will be allowed to leave the concentration camp and get a minimum wage job in Israel so that there is the appearance of economic prosperity. That's what's going on. That's not how the world lives. Imagine if we put the Jews in a concentration camp and treated them the way that they are treating the Palestinians. There would be a hue and outcry like you wouldn't believe, as there should be. But the double standard there is unreal. We haven't been thinking about the Palestinian people. Well, now, guess what? Are you listening to us now? Are you listening to the Palestinian people? You're damn right the world is. And I'm sorry it took the deaths of so many Israeli citizens. Again, I'm not going to use the word innocent except children. But if you lived in Israel and you, as an adult, and you've tolerated the government that continues to perpetrate these ongoing crimes against the Palestinians, if you haven't spent your ever waking moment demonstrating in the streets saying, not my Israel, not my government, not me, then you're not innocent. Shouldn't have been killed, but you're not innocent. Israel is not the innocent party here. Israel is not the victim. Israel is the victimizer, and they've been victimizing the Palestinian people for decades, but we pretend it isn't happening. It's happening, Cynthia. Why now? When's a good time for people to stand up and defend their rights? When is the right time to do it? It's not about convenience to the West. It's about people unwilling to continue to be treated in this fashion. And it's not the Palestinian people that did this, but it's Hamas feeding off of the anger, feeding off of the righteous outrage against Israel for what they do every day. Israel created Hamas, Israel empowered Hamas, and now Israel is paying the price for its mistakes. Generally speaking, the mainstream media is very sympathetic to Israel, especially in Western European countries. And so the coverage is going to be unabashedly pro-Israeli. Now, if you move away from there, you get into the Middle East, you'll get coverage that is more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. You'll get in some places coverage that's sympathetic to the Hamas cause. You've seen, but most people who, entities such as, Turkey's President Erdogan, he's speaking out in defense of the Palestinian people. There's very few nations that have come out and said, we support what Hamas has done, because frankly speaking, the slaughter of civilians, it can't be condoned. It can't be encouraged. It has to be condemned. And what Hamas did is contemptuous, and it must be condemned. But most people are standing up, however, for the Palestinian people. And everybody recognizes that Hamas's actions were set in motion by Israel's policy against the Palestinian people. And so I think it depends where you are in the world, but there's a large camp outside of America and European West that is speaking out in support of the Palestinian people today. And there are some voices in America and in Europe that are starting to do the same thing. The tragedy is that there's going to be a lot of dead Palestinians before this is over. The only silver lining in that extraordinarily dark cloud is that the suffering of the Palestinian people will hopefully trigger a human response in the hearts of people around the world to finally say there must be a solution, and to start holding Israel accountable for what they have done to create the conditions for this horror that's transpiring in front of us.